Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who is about to tell me something of a bedtime story.
Tim Longo. Hello.
Yes, he's going to tell me a little story about this character. He's got kind of a funny accent. And tell me a little bit about that. It's also a little nod to the fact that we're recording late for me. So
yes. Thank you for staying up for sure. Yes, and
layers of meta.
Quite a handsome fellow that I'm going to tell you a story about. And he's you hear him over there on the other side. So let me jump into the intro. I'm happy and excited to welcome Remi Lacoste to the podcast. In fact, we've mentioned, I don't think I forget if I mentioned this too, Remi, but we've actually mentioned him on the podcast various times because he's, in my past, been my best example of a cinematographer in games. But let me continue with the intro. Remi got his start in working at UbiSoft in 1998. And if I get any of this wrong, he will correct me after I'm done. Working on games such as the Prince of Persia series, including The Sands of Time, of course, which we'll talk about today with him. And its sequels, as well as Assassin's Creed and other franchises. I think most of his roles at Ubisoft were cinematography based. While there, he was a camera and cinematics designer and eventually director, cinematics director. He was there for 8 years until he moved on to Behavior Interactive to work on WET as the camera specialist. In 2009, he moved to Crystal Dynamics, where he was hired as a lead camera designer for the Tomb Raider reboot. He did a GDC talk once they shipped called Creating an Emotionally Engaging Camera for Tomb Raider, which we've mentioned on the podcast, I think, a few times at this point. And
sure.
Hopefully Brett can link that. I believe it's accessible to all in the GDC vault. And then went on to act as cinematics experience director on Rise of the Tomb Raider and game director, one of the game directors on Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Avengers, most recently. Remi now has left Crystal Dynamics after many years and is working as an experience director at The Initiative for Microsoft. Remi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tim and Brett, for having me over. Great introduction. I have nothing to say.
Yeah,
it's pretty much correct.
You're the person we probably talk about the most when we talk about cameras, both because Tim has worked with you, but also because of that talk, which is for me one of the best talks I've seen at GDC in all the years I've gone. I've gone 15 times, and that's one I always think of. There's a handful of talks, and I'm like, this was a great talk from that year. And Tim and I were actually in the audience that day, so I will definitely find that and put it in the show notes for folks.
Oh, thank you so much. It was my first talk, and I moved just a couple of years in the US, so my accent was still a bit rougher. and first talk on Friday at 4 p.m. for the last slot of the week. But it went well, and for me, I cared a lot, and to speak up about this subject that I care a lot about, and that sometimes is misunderstood. Because I always say, if the job is well done, people don't actually realize how much work there's behind the camera inside a video game.
Exactly.
But it's easy to point out or to put the blame on the camera when something feels bad, or it's like a bad goalie in sport.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's definitely one of those things where you don't notice if it's doing well, and then it's worse when it's not. And I actually went back before we started recording today and went back through the presentation and refreshed my memory. And man, that thing hits everything. Like anyone who is interested in 3D camera cinematography in video games, like that is just a blueprint. So yeah, kudos to you again on that. So one of the ways we do like to start, and we know the listeners like to hear Remi, is basically kind of talking about how you got into the industry, your early years, if you want to talk about sort of where you, I didn't mention the intro where you went to college, but you might want to mention that and kind of a little bit about your background and how you got to UbiSoft. Can you kind of talk about some of the early days of Remi Lacoste?
Sure. When I was a kid, first I did play 8-bits, Nintendo 8-bits games, and I was into games, a little bit of a nerd, but also like I loved art and theater and storytelling. So I went to visual arts and I studied film as well. Actually, that's where I met Patrice Desilets and Philippe Morin at University of Montreal in film studies. And then I explored the different types of medium. I always tried to push all different types of media, photography, painting, but mostly video and film. And at some point, I had an opportunity to work at UbiSoft. There was an opening, and since I knew those guys working there already, I thought it would be an interesting way, an opportunity to explore a new medium. So after playing Half-Life, I was super excited to see actually how games evolved, because I didn't play games for a couple of years. And I was interested to explore how we could tell stories in the middle of gameplay with scripted events and all that kind of stuff. So I started as a level designer on a couple of projects, but it didn't end up being exactly what I had in mind. So I left the industry to work on a script and a couple of short films. But after a year or so, I gave it a second chance, and also I was looking for salary. So I got back at Ubisoft and I worked on a Rainbow Six game as a level designer, and then I worked on a Myst game. But then I got approached by Philippe, who was the lead camera designer on Sands of Time. I heard about that Prince of Persia game. So I moved on to this project, and that's when I got my first chance to actually do something that I was more passionate about, or I thought I could use more of my background or my learnings and apply it to a video game. So I did work on a camera designer on this one, and then I switched to lead on Warrior Within and Two Thrones.
Amazing. Okay, so on Sands of Time, you were one of the camera designers. So can you explain specifically on Sands of Time, at least if you have memory of it, sort of what was your role like? Like what was the tasks and the day-to-day for a camera designer on that game?
Mm-hmm. So I think, back in the days, I don't even think this role existed in the industry.
No, definitely not.
I was called a camera specialist. And so the basic, what I would be doing basically is work with level designers and just create a set of camera to support gameplay, but also develop an aesthetic that would fit with the game. So I would work with a programmer, of course, and develop the tools in order to develop this aesthetic or to create more options for us to be able to create and go around bugs and stuff like that.
So you work pretty closely with level designers specifically, it sounds like. And was that on Sands of Time, were you focused on largely cameras for level design work, or were there, how did it kind of break down? Like, were there someone else working on this sort of combat camera or more dynamic cameras, or were you kind of touching different aspects? How was it split up?
Yeah, good question. Philippe, as the lead, he was more involved into developing the core system. So the systemic camera and the combat camera, I was in charge of, if you want, all the traversal mechanic behavior of the camera and setting up the camera for basically everything else. Level navigation, in-game cinematics, and what we call the visions that would, this little montage that would appear when you save your game and give you a preview of what's happening next. And of course, what we called the alternate cameras. Those were sort of helpers that you could trigger with one of the bumpers or the triggers.
Yeah.
And those cameras would pull back real far and give you some spatial context of where you are, so you can better assess where to go in that 3D space.
Yes, I was going to ask specifically about those because I use them. We both played on, I think, Brett, you played on PC as well, right?
I did, yes.
Yeah, we both played on PC, so we had to map our controls onto the controller to kind of simulate it. So I think Brett didn't end up playing with them, but I actually use those alternate cameras quite heavily myself to do what you were saying. And I did want to ask you sort of about, now that you brought it up, like what the goals were there. And I guess you kind of already shared that it was to get a better sense of relativity for them. Was that something, I mean, to kind of, one of the things that I probably warned you, but when we talked before doing the podcast, is that we kind of get into the weeds on stuff because nobody else really does, and so we like to get down and talk about very little specific nuances of like how game development works. And so, for the alternate cameras, do you have any memory of sort of like how that as a mini feature or sub feature came to be? Like, was that from playtesting that you kind of realized you needed to have something to frame, a pretty complicated room, or was that, thought up from the beginning and you knew you were always going to do it, or did it kind of surface out of a need?
Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, I don't actually remember when they came to life, but there was definitely a need to help provide the player more context. Spatial context, and also there was one of the few opportunities for me to express myself as an artist, to frame the space in interesting ways. So because during gameplay, the main thing would be showing the next traversal prims, or guide the player in the space, or prevent them from dying so they can better judge the distance in front of the trap. But the alternate cameras, basically, you can still play while triggering those cameras, but generally it would be more of a sort of establishing shot. So this would be kind of a double use, like to create those very nice composition and eye candy camera shots, but also help the player get some more pulled out view to understand where they are in the space.
Did you did you stick with them with the Two Thrones and the Warrior Within? I haven't played those in a while.
Yes.
You did, okay, yeah, because I didn't even know these alternate cameras were. I apologize, I didn't know they were in there because I don't read the manual. Which is a problem for these older games usually.
It's one of those that we didn't create a tutorial for it, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it didn't. I didn't think it had come up. Yeah, so so I didn't know about it. And Tim was like, "There's an alternate camera. It's kind of useful." And I was like, "Oh, huh, okay." And then I would go and play and forget that he had told me that. So
I would say an inspiration for that could have been also the what Rockstar did with the cinematic camera. I always thought it was such a brilliant use of an optional camera when you play the GTA games and you press circle on PlayStation. I think in Dead you have this cinematic camera that just provides you like this cool cinematic view. It makes the game very hard to play, but it's very satisfying.
Right, sure.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I found them to be, I mean, it's great for you to bring up the sort of artistic side of it for you too, especially as the camera designer on it, because I often felt that the compositionally were very cool and very interesting. An example that I pretty vividly remember was the final descent up the tower toward the end. There's an alternate camera, which you probably won't remember, of course, but having just played it, I remember it. And there's one alternate camera that obviously, as you can imagine, because you're climbing up the tower, it's framing from above, bird's eye view above, and you see him, and of course, like Remi said, as I probably mentioned during the series, that, it's still interactable. So, you can still play that way technically, but he is so small on screen, and it makes the tower look so amazing, and it's not a view that you would get any other way, really, other than maybe in some cinematic establishing shots. But yeah, it was very effective. And it's too bad that it wasn't tutorialized, because I think maybe more people might have used it. But yeah, it was cool. So I'm interested to talk a little bit more about sort of like the level designer and camera designer relationship, and sort of like how, if you have any memories or, even challenges or war stories about sort of like that process. Because as you said earlier, this role, especially in those days, was not really a role. I mean, it wasn't a common thing. Even when we brought you onto Tomb Raider, it wasn't really a common thing to have somebody devoted to cameras so holistically, and I think that's why we were excited to have you on the team. But what was what was that dynamic like? How closely did you work with the level designers, and was there a give and take? And, were you able to help them, because I can imagine as a level designer myself, there's times when, the level design just isn't going to work for making a good camera, and so how do you work that through with the level designer?
Yeah, I would say a lot of my career has been, so soon I realized that being a camera designer is not only working on cameras. It's actually building that relationship, and it's actually understanding the space. I did level design too, a little bit before too. But making sure we can anticipate problems, because often, this is very general, but often the LDs, the level designers, would play their levels without actually thinking about the camera, and they would be great at it, right? Because they know exactly how to play it, so they would build their level with all the complex traversal, the jumping wall to wall, and all the different complexity you can find in Sands of Time. So then it became really, for me, the challenge of understanding how to present it to the player.
Yeah.
So I got better at understanding that and working together for a more early collaboration, so that we can work together, and I could also, without sounding condescending, educating the new LDs to avoid certain situations and anticipating those problems.
So you kind of developed, did you, I'll ask in the form of a question, but did you sort of develop rule sets or goals, if you will, that ended up, I mean, because Sands of Time, was Sands of Time then your first sort of 3D platformer that you were working on, and in this camera capacity? Was it the first one?
Yeah, it's my first ever role as a camera specialist.
Yeah. So you were kind of discovering as you went, sort of what makes good.
Yeah, sure, definitely. I did work on Donald Duck Quack Attack as a level designer. It was my first game ever. And I did a 2D level, and I did a 3D level, which the action was more driving forward. And at the time, Crash Bandicoot was popular, and I remember studying also the way they would do these cameras where the camera is facing you as you're running toward the camera. Mm-hmm. So I was aware of some of the challenges or the benefit of using a good camera, but this was the first time.
So our scoop here is the early days of some of the most cinematic games that have been released. Is Donald Duck Quack Attack is the inspiration and the genesis of. Okay, got it. That's our.
No, it was a fun project.
I'm sure.
It was all about rhythm and UbiSoft. There was a lot of the early school, and still now probably like a big respect to Nintendo and the Nintendo school of doing things. So this type of platformer felt right in the wheelhouse of Rayman and that type of games too. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's in the Rayman camp of types of games. So speaking of sort of 2D versus 3D, I think one of the other things that we talked a lot about is the difficulties. And the reason we talk about camera so much, obviously, is as you're playing a game like Prince, the camera is constantly doing work to try to make things seem fluid and smooth for the player. And so from a 3D platformer perspective, like if you have any memory of specifically Sands of Time, but I think I'll broaden it out. So, if your memory's not so good, there's just sort of like in the general space of 3D platformers, like what are some of the challenges that you did run into or you do run into with this? Obviously there's the level design component, but
tons of them.
Yeah.
Camera is always a lot of challenges, to be honest. So Sense of Time was trying to reinvent the classic platformer, but preserve the spirit of the original Prince, which was in 2D, right?
Yeah.
And it was this like death-defying sort of like platforming where a small thing could like throw you off and kill you. That's why probably the rewind mechanic, the Sense of Time mechanic, came for, to help the player for those like crazy challenges. But since Prince of Persia Sense of Time was literally like a 3D navigation puzzle. That's how I saw it at the time, and I still see it as this sort of like 3D puzzle where you have to figure out. We were making the full use of the depth and the horizontal axis and the vertical space, so it was challenging and fun to figure out how to use traversal mechanics to avoid traps and travel through this immense palace. So for me, it was actually a puzzle in itself to figuring out how to present it to the player. The game would be very difficult to play without the camera actually pointing in the right direction, or even be unplayable in some cases. So I would say the main challenge is that the player steering is directly affected by the camera. So it was very helpful for us to take over the camera orientation and put the player in a certain direction or orientation, so that when you would press on the stick and jump, you wouldn't miss and fall or miss the column. As an example, if you would jump from a column to another column, we would do a camera cut on landing, and this finding the exact moment to do the cut was without being disruptive or jarring was in itself also like an art that we developed. Not that there's been cases where it's been jarring, and we'll get to that later. But repositioning the camera in a specific angle was crucial, especially when doing a series of jumps between columns, because a flick of the stick in the wrong direction would throw the jump off, and then the player would fall to their death. So when this was done perfectly, the game was very fluid, and if this wasn't visible to the player, it made the animation and the traversal flow uninterrupted and very rewarding, a very rewarding experience for the player.
Yeah, that's a good point about the camera cuts. It's definitely something I was hoping that would come up, because there's definitely you can, I don't know, I'm making an assumption, but I can kind of tell that there's probably times when maybe the compromise between level design and camera design didn't quite come to fruition, if you know what I mean, and sort of like there's a cut that kind of just needed to happen because of the way that the two moments kind of intersected, but there really maybe wasn't much of an option. You just kind of had to do it, and it was discombobulating sometimes. But I mean, to your point, like this was you were saying, I'm glad you mentioned the phrase of kind of reinventing, Prince of Persia, and really 3D platforming wasn't really, other than the mascot games like the Crash Bandicoots or the Marios, there really wasn't anything out there like this. And so, like, what inspirations, like, how did you guys approach that problem? Was it just a lot of playtesting and just kind of experimentation, or how did you start with problem solving this thing when there really wasn't anything else to emulate?
I think it was a lot of, for my part, for the the traversal. I think it was a lot of trial and error, a lot of experimentation and guts.
Yeah.
I could, but some of the games probably at the time, because I was putting myself back in the days, and probably some of the games I played at the time were Jack and Daxter or Ico, that also were using 3D platforming in some sort. The Super Mario 64 also, which invented the 3D camera, was a very good reference for us to understand how we could create our own follow camera behavior, the behavior that always try to reorient itself behind the player as you're moving around the space, which not all third-person games actually use.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I'm glad you said behavior there, because, you know, one of the things I think naively, you know, somebody, you know, who hasn't worked on these sorts of things might think is like, well, you just put a spline in place where the camera's going to be, and it picks the closest point on the spline or something like that, you know, to follow the path that the you know, like that would be the naive thing, right? Is just put the camera on a path and just make it keep going. But you're actually blending between camera behaviors to achieve the results. Like, how many of them would you say there were? Like, are we talking like a small handful or a couple dozen, or like?
So the way it worked is it was super handcrafted. So we had not dozens, not hundreds, I would say thousands of volumes for the entire game. And it was a trigger volume based, not even trigger planes, just volumes, so that every time the character would enter a volume, we would trigger a certain set of attributes or a different camera type, so that if you were moving on a ledge, doing some ledge shimmy, then we might want to remove that sort of like auto repositioning of the camera, so that you could get that sort of spline feeling and keep the camera straight on a line. Sometimes we would lock the camera in place and prevent the camera from panning if you jump between columns, because if you would jump back and forth, as an example, on between walls, when you do jump, left, right, and climb up the wall, if the camera would pan and track you as every time you go left and right, that would be disorienting and also nauseating.
and throw off your timing, probably, right? And because
exactly.
The motion would be kind of counter to your expectation, to be able to time it.
Exactly. To also some other times though, because Tim was asking about challenges, the camera was also, we would reposition the camera to show something in the foreground, like the top of ledges. If the player stands on the ground and cannot see the ledge where they're going, we would reposition the camera, stuff like that. We had to create those flyby intros and alternate cameras to help the player understand the space. Create cameras to introduce the traps, because top-down view helps understanding how the traps are moving or are located in relation to the player. But we also had other tricks to overcome those challenges and facilitate traversal and help player. As an example, you know, when you perform a wall run and then you have to do a time jump 90-degree left to jump to a column, we would use the light and the shadow on the wall.
As an indicator.
As an indicator, like simple tricks like that, or creating grooves on the ground when there's like this post with sharp blades moving sideways, so you would know, because it's tough in 3D to gauge your distances in front of you. And we would use all those tricks as well.
Thousands of placed volumes is what
thousands. And the problem is, if you were navigating into a very vertical place, imagine the space is filled with volumes and the player just jumps across the room, but not in the intended way.
Right.
What could happen?
Yeah.
That would trigger. What would happen if? What happened is the player would trigger all the wrong cameras. So that's when QA and playtest would be super useful, because if you would, even when you fall to your death on the way down, you would trigger all the volumes by crossing them until you die or hit the kill plane, right? So we had to create lists in every single volume. We had an exclusion list.
Oh my God!
So that the way it worked is, we would put the name of all the volumes. So if you came from volume 1 and you'd cross volume 2, you would put the name of volume 1 and volume 2, so that it would ignore, if you came from that volume, don't trigger this one. And this, we would do that for every single volume. And sometimes the list would go, like there would be like 5 of them.
Oh my God. That's amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
See,
so
people see what they go through for you.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean that's funny, because that is exactly, it's funny, it just makes me think, like, that's exactly how it happens. Is like, your first time out, you find something that works and you maybe don't think, what kind of work is that going to involve? And then at a certain point you find the failure and you're like, oh, well, we don't have time to solve that, so we'll just make this list. And now you have to touch every bit in the game. Oh my goodness, I love it.
So, I mean, related to that falling to your death example you gave there, Remi, what I kind of, and then also kind of going back to the behavior topic. Yes, sure, there is a linearity to the game. Of course, it's a linear game for the most part.
That was helpful. That was helping us, because if this wasn't linear, that would have been much more difficult. But
yeah, exactly. However, what I was going to bring up though is there are some times when you can essentially go backwards.
Yes.
And there's also times when, say, you're running around on the ground, which is more analog and not obviously technically linear, because you can the player can just run around in the space. Yeah. So was there some sort of blending between some sorts of dynamic cameras, obviously there was, and then the player has control as well. So I mean, or maybe that was more of Philippe's side. Philippe, is that his name?
Yeah.
That was Philippe, his side of kind of like making sure that the transitions between the dynamic cameras, and you know what I mean? No, it's sort of like, it's the connection between the two is what I'm interested in.
Yeah, that was all me and my assistant, Max, who worked with me on that. Max Berico. So that joined us later in the project. He was from QA, so he was one of the best, at picking up the potential problems. But what was I going to say? Yeah, that was on me to figuring out how we can transition. I would say some of the most awkward but necessary camera placement were those cameras when you enter a very tiny room, and then the only way is to put an anchored camera in the corner, so that when you enter the room, there's a cut, and then the camera is looking at you like a surveillance camera in the corner of the room. And we had to use some tricks here to make sure it was a little better. So what we would do is that once you enter the room and the camera is behind your back, and you enter a room and the camera cuts to a different angle, we had to keep the player, what's the term? The player orientation, or the player facing, if you want, so that if you pressed up when you enter the room, the character would still go and keep its direction instead of going back the way it came, because as the camera jumps to a totally different angle, then the character would go in a different angle. So we would only switch the character steering after the player releases the camera or releases the left stick and push it again.
Right. Yeah, and we've talked about that actually with various games of this era, because we've obviously played others around this time frame, and it is tricky because one of, I think, some players' instincts, and it's actually my instinct often, when the camera does cut, I often let go of the stick because I'm maybe it's because I'm a developer or whatever, but I get anxious, So
it's because you're old.
Yeah, that's that too. Yeah. And
experience. I'm sorry, experience is what I mean.
Sure. Thank you. But to your point, Remi, like that is I don't know if listeners would pick up on that nuance, but that is a common trick to continue to keep the player moving in the direction that they assume if their stick is still pressed in that direction. Exactly. But if you let go, it resets once, and the camera then has cut. This is a common problem. And for instance, we talked about this probably when we played Resident Evil, the first Resident Evil, which is notorious for this.
Less so that, but I think actually Devil May Cry, which actually has sort of similar camera system, at least as for transitions, actually does what they did in Prince of Persia. So it probably came up there as well.
Right.
The original Devil May Cry. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And because I do tend to, when that transition happens, take my my finger off of the direction of the stick that I'm pressing, it does actually discombobulate me, because now when I reinitiate it, I'm going and I'll switch back, right? And I'll go in the opposite direction, and then, oftentimes leave the room I just came into accidentally, so it's a challenge. I mean, I think that, anyway, we don't have to go too deeply into it, but it's a good example of like a bit of a conundrum for these kinds of games.
Yeah, those are probably the most jarring situations that I would try to avoid if possible. But sometimes it wasn't too bad, because let's say you get into a small room and you have to use some of those circular levers, that you push to open a door in a different room. Well, we would trigger that camera only when you actually attach to. We use that trick often also in the reboot of Tomb Raider. So only when you interact with the object, the camera would pull to the corner to show you a different angle or show you the result of what you're doing as you're pushing or pulling a lever. Then you don't have to run in circles, so your frame of reference doesn't have to change so much. So it's not as jarring as if you're running in circle in that sort of situation.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And I think that's actually one that probably players and listeners wouldn't even necessarily pick up on, but there's level design flow, but there's also interactive design, like objects like that, like the levers, or like you said, some of the examples of that in Tomb Raider. And because the level design and camera design knows the player is connected to those, then it's a binary thing, right? And then you can kind of control the camera. You have all the variables are known, so you're like, okay, well, this is the best place for the camera because we know what's happening, and that's something that maybe people wouldn't necessarily think of when they're playing. Hopefully, as we talked about in the opener, you don't want them to think about it, right? You just want it to work, but it's a good thing to point out, I think, for this discussion. So I mean,
the other thing to talk about that sort of camera transition issue is it's very hard to train. Like, it's hard to train Tim not to let go of the stick. Or whatever, right? I mean, once a person kind of has the way that they interact with a thing, it's basically impossible to change it. So it feels like the only way to deal with it is to avoid the problem, like trying not to have it happen, because there's no way to train it without like explicitly trying to put on even if you put text on the screen, what do you say? Like, I don't even, like, just keep holding the stick. Like, that doesn't seem like the right thing to say, so
how do you talk about it, right?
It's very hard to design the tutorialization for that interaction. So and camera perception and spatial perception and control of your character in third person is a very fragile thing. So even in later games that I worked on, like on the Tomb Raider series, we did, not on the latest ones, but in the reboot and Rise as well, I think we used the camera splines in some of the runouts, some in the chase sequence or the escape sequences, and even that, because the camera is positioned at a specific angle, it's very tricky to make sure you can read the ledges where you have to jump, and even this can throw off your steering a little bit. Yeah, I like that. That is a good way to put it. It's fragile. It's because it's not how we perceive the world, like naturally as agents, right? So it's a fragile contract you have with the player. Yeah, it's well put.
Well, so I mean, you mentioned, Remi, in the pre-show that you kind of went back to watch some playthroughs of Prince, just to kind of refresh your memory. And you mentioned to me that there was some kind of interesting nostalgia that came back to you for watching some of that stuff. And so was there? I mean, I think kind of two-part question. I'm interested in if there's any of that nostalgia that you're open to sharing, or thoughts that you had that kind of brought you back when you were watching the playthrough, because I know it's been a long time since you probably watched or played the game. And then the second question is, was there anything that was jogging your memory from watching the game that you kind of cringed at, and like, kind of looking back at being sort of the first one of something that you've literally made a career out of since then, that were sort of like, wow, that's how we did it back then. We know so much better now. And you've kind of thrown in a few of those tidbits as we've been talking, but were there any, as you went back and watched it, that were jogging your memory?
I will just get the bad stuff out of the way. So the stuff that make me cringe for sure is, especially because I watched on YouTube someone else play. Yeah. When I play, I'm an artist with my camera, but no, watching someone's play. But the guy that I was watching, I really appreciate him first to put a playthrough online, and he was playing pretty well. But I could see that sometimes there was too many camera cuts, jump, because of the nature of the level design. Sometimes the Prince would jump or vault over a small window, so we had to cut on the other side. And often, automatically, it would make him like jump through the window and then jump over again because of the camera switch, or little bugs like that. But also the repetitive nature of the formula we were using. So every time we would go into a new room, we would like camera cut, show the Prince, fly into the space, and show the core ingredients, like the exit, the puzzle ingredients, the enemies. But this was like the formula we would repeat over and over. And because it was very repetitive, especially that I was watching the playthrough, the 4.5 hours playthrough, I was like, geez, there's so many of them, and it gets a little tiring to watch those over and over. So this,
that's funny, because I that feels like an audience problem more than a play problem, because I appreciated those to orient me in the space, right? I appreciated knowing, okay, this is where I'm trying to get to. These are the things in my way, as a player.
Yes.
But I can imagine watching somebody else play it, being like, ugh, because you're not, you don't have the same contract. You don't have to worry about those. The other person's going to deal with that. The person you're watching play, right? So that's interesting. I think that's an inch. That's just.
Maybe I created too many of them.
I don't know. Maybe you did, because you had so many things to do, thousands of volumes. But I don't know. Yeah, playing them, they didn't feel like a problem to me.
Thank you. It was hard sometimes, because we would do them in 3D Studio Max, and sometimes when we would try to reference the level, the actual puzzle object, because it's in a later state, wouldn't be there. So you would have to imagine where things are. And that was definitely challenging. But every time I would make one, definitely would try to make it pretty and nice to watch. And so that was always the goal. Make it useful, but also aesthetically pleasing to watch.
Talking about the today times, to your point about repetition, even from an audience perspective, because Brett's making a good point of like, we're in the era of viewership, right? People watching games is now a thing versus versus just something that used to be more rare. But these days, like, how would you, that point about repetition, because to Brett's point, those vignettes have a important purpose for the player. But in an age of streaming or what have you, or do you have any ideas about, or how do you solve that repetition problem these days? Or do you just not have them anymore? Like what's the modern, how would you tackle that these days? Not to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious if that's a solved problem now or not.
It's a good question. I think sometimes I wonder to what extent we would still need those.
Yeah.
I think some of the puzzles were very complex, spatially to even grok when you look at them. So those were helpful, and some spaces needed more those sort of fly through than others. But I think because I worked on this whole trilogy, when I was done with this game, and we did use a little bit of those fly through in wet, but I was like, when I worked on Tomb Raider, I was like, no, I'm not going to make another fly through, also because I felt like it was like a dated sort of aesthetic.
Yeah.
And we try to really show things from the player's point of view and not have this sort of like omniscient camera.
Yeah.
If it's a word in English.
Yeah. Omniscient.
Omniscient.
Yeah.
So yeah, to keep things close to the player, to make them feel what the character feels, so not to show that the exit before they actually sees them.
Yeah, and today with greater fidelity in the graphics as well, you can do more with the presentation of the space as you're playing it, so that you can see these elements more plainly as you play, I guess, as well. So that sort of helps the problem too. Yeah. Plus, you were doing it for the first time, right? So you know, you didn't know what people were going to know, so you're trying to help them, right? I think.
And I think it was fine for the time. Yeah. I think for the time it was fine. I think a good level design might not need it as much as a bad level design, and sometimes we tend to use camera as a crutch, so to like compensate for a bad design, and this is good for today's game as well. So introducing a space or navigating a space in a way that you can reveal it in a natural way without forcing it onto the player, I think is probably better in general.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head there as far as like, one of the topics that you can imagine, because for the podcast we play older games, right? Classic games that had some sort of influence on the industry over time. And one of the common, I think, themes that we come back to time and time again really are those band-aids that people would come up with to solve a particular problem, that because it was, quote unquote, maybe one of the first of its kind, we just didn't know, right? We didn't know what was the right thing to do yet. And so these flyover vignettes were appropriate for solving a specific particular problem. But to your point on Tomb Raider, and I don't remember if we had that conversation back in the day, but I can imagine the conversation where you said, no, we're not doing these. But you're right in that it's so many years later, so much has changed. We've learned so much, modernization. And, you know, the answer to a lot of these Band-Aids is like, don't have them, just don't do it, do better in a way, and think differently about it. And to Brett's point about fidelity, but also I think the design side of it is critical because, just to give an example that was in Crystal's wheelhouse, I think Crystal I remember talking to some of the team before we started the reboot about some of the previous games like Tomb Raider Legend or Underworld or what have you, where there's still some of those fly-throughs might have even occurred, and they were very influenced by Prince of Persia for Tomb Raider Legend specifically and such. But then, moving into the reboot, there definitely was like this need and want to move further forward, and not, like Brett said, use those as a crutch because there were solutions and we did know better. you guys knew better. So yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. So the answer is don't do it, right? not do them differently.
In some cases, like camera cuts, not necessarily flybys, but also camera cuts were necessary. So there was a lot of instances where you would pull a lever or step on a pressure plate, and this would open a door outside your view frustum. So the only way you could show the reaction of your action was to do a camera cut if the door was not in front of you. So in those cases, we would also always try to show if it was possible to create the level design in a way that when the camera cut is pulled out, you could see your
what
action. So you still see your character on the screen and also see the door opening. Because if you cut to something and cut back to the player, sometimes you also get confused. You lose your place. So you get disoriented and you don't remember where you are in the space. So.
Yeah. So another sort of lesson learned of like, try not to do that anymore. Right? It's like, and design, not to say it in a negative way of like, don't do that, but more of do the better version, which is like you said, like frame the door opening in a way that you can see it while you pull the lever or what have you. So that's a great point that I think, again, it's a nuanced thing that if it's working well, players won't notice, and probably listeners may not really think about, oh yeah, those have kind of gone away because they're not as good as if you were to have the recognition of what happened right on camera. So that's a great distinction for modern, progression of an idea and how it has changed over the years.
But we still do those. I would say the learning point and the important point here is you can cut to whatever you want, but when you come back to the player, come back with a blend. So if you cut, you blend back to the player so that you cut to a location and then the camera travels back to where your character is.
Got it. Right.
So you keep the spatial relativity between the two. Exactly.
Right. So you know where to go. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. I want to pull on one quick thread just to talk about sort of like to get into the sort of like nitty gritty on tools a little bit. You mentioned 3D Studio Max. Like what can you give us like a short version of like what the tools process was for you guys? Were you working did you have camera tools or did you actually have to do everything outside in another package and then import it in?
The 3D Studio Max was only used for flyby cameras and for in-game cinematics. The rest was all in-engine.
Okay.
Was it I don't remember if it was real time or we had to build, but the rest, all those like thousands of volumes, it was all in-engine.
In-engine tools. Yeah. And you said you worked with the tools programmers and stuff to develop that because it obviously didn't exist before this game, or was it?
Yeah, no. If I remember, this was probably like Rayman 2 engine that got changed. And I think in the middle of the development, we might have had to switch engine to make it more.
You went to it was the Jade. It was the Jade engine.
That's right.
Beyond Good and Evil engine. Yeah.
That's right.
Crazy. That's crazy. Yeah, Ubisoft has always been pretty interesting about how they use their engines and how they migrate them to do different things.
But then after building the Anvil engine for the first Assassin's Creed, there was an army of programmers on that. I remember.
Yeah. Well, so I kind of cut, we got cut off on the sort of nostalgic part. Like when you were looking back from it, I think as we're getting sort of close to the end of time, I want to hear, no pun intended, I want to hear about your nostalgic moments. Like you're looking back and you mentioned to me that you had some fond memories and stuff. Like when you were watching the game, was there anything that came to mind where you kind of just hadn't thought about in a while or something like that?
I think it was a mix of everything I mentioned, being inside that world and collaborating with that team, I mean, if you look at the amount of talent working on that project and where they are now, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
Of course, Patrice, which owns his own company at Panache with Alex, the animation director, is a genius of animation, and Philip has his own company called Red Barrels with David Chateauneuf, the lead LD on that project. Remi Lacoste, another Lacoste, was the art director, but he doesn't need presentation now. He's like the Assassin's Creed franchise art director, and he's like huge in the industry. And a lot of other talent all across that team. So it was really a very special moment to have the chance to collaborate with those guys and to make history with that game.
Yeah.
So definitely, for me, there's two moments in my career that I think two like major milestone. One was Sands of Time, and the other one was the reboot of Tomb Raider. So that's why I keep that very fond and very happy about it. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I mean, the other thing that we talked about with the game that sort of, I think we both, I mean, I don't want to speak for Brett, but my memory is we both really enjoyed is it's tonally a very different game than we get these days in a lot of ways, right? I mean, just the storybook nature of it, the time mechanic, the very cohesive sort of contextualized mechanics in the way that time works and the whole theme around time. It's like I don't want to say wholesome. It's the only word I can think of, but it's kind of a wholesome game in most ways. And I can imagine kind of looking back to it in that way as well, of just like it's a bit of a gem. And having and you make a good point about the talent, because I didn't even think about that side of it, of like that was one of the things we talked about in the first episode of this series in particular, was because this is our first sort of classic UbiSoft game that we've played through our 259 episodes. It's kind of bad that we haven't gotten to UbiSoft until now, but this, from my memory, being in the industry at the time, this was Ubisoft's kind of fork in the road for them as well. I feel like this game represented, okay, they really have something. Like they're going to potentially go places. And I think not only just for yourself, but I think for the company, I feel like this was a bit of a, milestone project in a good way.
Yeah, that and Splinter Cell, and then the Rainbow Six games definitely took
all around that same time. Yeah. But I think as far as 3D platformers go, specifically, like Sands of Time was really it was a big blip on the radar for the industry. So
and you mentioned it too, like this sort of like Arabian Nights or storytelling, and the story narrated by the main character adds such a charm and nice quality to it. And I loved working on Warrior Within and the Two Thrones, those games, as I became a lead, and they had different qualities, and they might have been liked or despised. And I don't know, some people reacted, I don't know, when Warrior Within came out, the tone was very, very different.
Yeah, the tone was very different. Yeah.
Very different.
We mentioned that on the show as well, just because it was, I mean, that was a trend, right? That it was, I feel like the first game was not, I don't remember what the sales numbers were, and I don't know if we talked about them, but maybe it was a way to like, well, maybe if we take that and marry it to this other trend, it really does gangbusters, right? It really connects and makes, really sells a lot of units. You had mentioned Rayman 2. I don't want to discount the strength of that franchise as well, because I loved Rayman 2, but I also feel like that's one that was more of a European hit, right? Like, and that's why I bring that up in the context of going a little bit grimmer. because I think that maybe was a correction that they were trying to make to hit North America better, right? You know what I mean? Because Rayman also has that sort of hopefulness. It's a very different, wackier sort of world, but it also is lighter, much more positive, not grim. Comical, you know what I mean? And that's that to me is more continental Europe, right? You know, in terms of taste.
The cartoon, well, it was made in Montpellier, in Paris, and there's a lot of tradition in graphic novel, and Jean-Michel Ancel worked on that. Michel Ancel, sorry.
Yes.
And which also, like, of course, directed Beyond Good and Evil, which is another amazing cult game that I love. But those were games made in Europe, and those I mentioned were the franchise built in Montreal.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, Remi, thank you so much for being on. Like I said, it's a treat to talk to somebody so specifically about this topic and to get pretty geeked out and nitty gritty about specific things like camera cuts and
placing all those volumes. I'm going to be thinking about that all night.
Yeah, I just wish, I wish sometimes. I'm sure more games do this than I'm just not thinking of, but I think some more games should have a mode where you can just turn some of the debug stuff on more easily for players who are interested, because I know, obviously it allows them to look behind the curtain, and they probably shouldn't, but I mean, that's just insane. Like, looking at those levels with all the volumes on, I think would blow people's minds. So yeah. And that's not the only game that does it. So
no, but I would say Tomb Raider, the reboot, and what followed in the Tomb Raider trilogy, you also used hundreds of like different volumes, but in a lot more sort of world of complexity, so that because the beauty of working on cameras on video games is creating moments, and I think finding any sort of moment to trigger an experience, and of course the camera plays a big role in that experience. So of course animation, the player jumping, landing, but going through a tight space. But yeah, Tomb Raider was also like very handcrafted.
Yeah. I just remember our conversations about the opening, specifically, and some of those like very claustrophobic moments, and even just starting the game upside down, and how we're dealing with camera in that opening sequence, and then escaping and stuff. And that's, it's just kudos to you and good work on that stuff. Cause I think that reboot is a good example of a team that really, used camera in an amazing way, as a player for myself afterwards. Right. Cause I didn't get to finish it with you guys. And so, it accomplished some amazing cinematography. And I mean that genuinely, in video games, because the camera matched the theme of the game. And so I think it was really, really well done.
Well, thank you. I think it's a sum of all its parts. I think the gameplay and the animation and everything has to be inspired and working together to create that magic.
Yes. Well said.
And a great place to wind down, actually. So I want to thank you again, Remi, so much for getting to talk to you here for an hour about this game that's a ways back in your career. I know it can be hard, and thank you for doing the work and checking it out, because that was helpful, I'm sure, to jar some memories. And I hope you have no nightmares about placing volumes tonight.
Not at all. And thank you so much for inviting me and to having me dive back into memory land. It's been great talking to you guys and listening to your question and your point of view, of course.
Awesome. Thank you.
welcome back from the break. I really enjoyed that conversation. I will say, having had him come from the same era that we started in, it's nice to see somebody leaving the film industry and coming to games instead of wanting to do the reverse. So that was nice.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. And he kind of mentioned it up top, his and I'm sure we've talked about this before, and I'm forgetting the details, but he mentioned kind of wanting to look into new mediums and and try different things out, and kind of unexpectedly finding games in that regard. And maybe some of that is sort of hindsight 2020 sort of stuff. But I know, like, when it comes to somebody who appreciates film and photography and television and stuff like Remi does, but then still understands the value of cinematography in games and how different it is and how it should be done differently and treated differently and respected differently. Like, I've never met anyone who gets it so well, so I was so excited that he was willing to come on and talk about it, because he's a gem of a person, who got to work on a gem of a game. So he just gets it, and it's so hard to find those people.
Yeah. Oh, and I mean, it's going to stick with me too, his whole thing about how that relationship with the player and his avatar is fragile. I mean, that's just like, chef's kiss moment, where I'm like, yes, that's exactly it. Like, I would not have known how to say that. Like, that's when we say, like, we're discombobulated or whatever, what we mean is the fragility was broken, right? That it got too strained and it broke. When you get confused in a game like that, especially a third person game, obviously first person games are different in that respect. So yeah, it was fascinating, and clearly he's thought about that stuff. Like, how do we prevent those moments from happening, and what does that mean, and how can the camera help achieve that? So, yeah.
Yeah,
also,
I mean,
I was gonna say also the idea that he had to make those flybys in Max, I'm sure because they had all the splines and all that stuff and direct camera controls that he could just leave in there. But ew. You forget that we used to do things like that. Anyway, that's just an aside.
And still do, unfortunately, sometimes.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yes, I'm sure.
Yeah. It was good. It was good. I'm so happy he was on, and I think it was a good, little bit out of order, but good capper to the Prince series. So hopefully people enjoy it.
Yeah, for sure. And for those who find any of this interesting at all, I cannot, trumpet enough how great Remi's talk was at GDC. It's focusing more on the Tomb Raider stuff, and maybe a little Prince of Persia, if I'm remembering this Prince of Persia. I can't remember if he talked about the later Prince of Persia, maybe just briefly.
I mean, he might have verbalized it. I don't think the slides, they might have later, but
okay.
I mean,
it's possible I'm like conflating an article as well, like, because I know I've followed Remi's work for years, not knowing it was Remi until I saw that Tomb Raider one. But like the scenes that he talks about there, and I know I've gushed about it on the podcast before, so I won't go on and on, but he talks about some specific scenes and like why the camera was chosen to do the things that it does in a game context. And it's fantastic. It's a great all-time top 10 for me, for GDC. And that's a lot of talks.
Yeah. If you just look at the deck itself that he used for it, I mean, it's literally, like I said, I breezed through it before, just to refresh my memory. I mean, I'm not joking when I say blueprint. It basically just deconstructs all of the different camera challenges and solutions and types and why they're used, how they're used, and it's very thoughtful and I think I would say probably pretty easy to follow too. Like, I think it's pretty well done in that regard too. So you don't have to be, some master to understand it, I think. So it's just kind of stuff that players would normally not think about, right? He just kind of breaks it down. So I'm sure lots of people will go back to that talk and use it as a white paper for their work.
Oh, yes. I can absolutely say that is true. I will not reveal why I say that is true, but I will say that has happened.
All right, good. Excellent.
I cannot say more. I also, another thing to segue, I can't say more about what we're going to play to in Final Fantasy VI, if you see what I did there.
Nice.
We're going to continue playing and kind of touch base with each other through the week to see how far we get and what our schedules allow. Neither one of us, for different reasons, had a lot of time to play this past weekend, and so we'll be using at least the weekend, but all of that. We are not also reading any email. We didn't have any new Prince of Persia email or anything to read this time, nor any reviews. But you can shoot those emails to us at devgameclub@gmail.com, or put those reviews up in the sort of Apple Podcasts thing or whatever podcatcher you use. And if we don't find it on our own, shoot us an email if we haven't read it out on the cast. We love to do that whenever we get reviews. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com or on Twitter at devgameclub. We can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end.
You are still stranding death, I believe, Mondays and Tuesday nights on your Twitch channel. Is that correct?
I am, yes. I skipped Monday this week for obvious reasons. As we are recording, I did tweet about that tonight on Monday, but I will be back on tomorrow, Tuesday, 6 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. It is a hoot to play that game, and I really, again, appreciate people coming out. I've had some higher numbers than I think I've had watching this game, and you can see why. I think it's a good, like Hitman, it's a good game to stream because it's just so crazy. You can even know how to describe it to people. And there's a lot of people who are coming on who've played it, so it's fun to have them sort of like give me pointers. And I basically have a bunch of Sherpas coming with me and helping me along the way. And yeah, so it's been fun. So America Strands, or Strands Across America. That was Across America is the other one that I might change the title of that because I think that one's funny. But anyway,
that's pretty good. Yeah, and I've been playing on twitch.tv, Brett Duville, The Last Story.
How's that been going?
Title. That is, well, I can't get anybody coming in to be Sherpas for me because nobody played this game.
Yeah.
It's a Mistwalker JRPG, action RPG. It's actually pretty interesting. You and I should probably talk about it at some point, just out of, there's some interesting things. There's this central mechanic where the main, you're controlling one character in a party of like up to 4. And there's a couple things with that are really wild. And the big thing is like that he can basically at will redirect all the enemy's attention on himself. With this, I don't know, mystical that got tattooed to his arm or something. So, mechanical thing. But, like, that's what he can do, that they justified with whatever weird JRPG story stuff. And then there's a top-down view where he can, like, activate other people's magic stuff to do things. It is wild. It is a really interesting battle system.
Crazy.
So, yeah, it's been a lot of fun to play. Anyway, I've been doing that weeknights at 7 p.m. Eastern, and I usually go for like an hour and a half. So, and all of this you can find on the Twitter because we announce and I retweet Tim's. That's our show. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton, commissioned by friend of the cast Aaron Evers, and our logo is by Mark Garcia. Have fun reading your bedtime stories this week, and good night.
Good night.